I thought betrayal was something that happened to other people, until it happened to me. What started as heartbreak soon turned into something far more unexpected, a chance to start over. The day I first met Susan was like any other, nothing remarkable at first glance. I had just started my first job at a small publishing firm, and Susan worked in the office next door as an editor. She introduced herself with a self-assured presence that instantly captivated everyone around her. There was something about her, an undeniable charisma that filled the room. From that moment, I was drawn to her in a way I couldn't explain. Back then, I had no idea how much that meeting would change the course of my life. Over time, our relationship evolved. What started as friendly exchanges between coworkers soon grew into a genuine connection. We'd often stay late at the office, throwing around ideas or debating the finer details of storytelling. Susan had this rare gift: she could find beauty in flawed stories, a perspective that always made me reconsider my own ideas. Those late nights turned into shared dinners, and before long, we were inseparable. A year later, proposing to Susan felt like the next chapter in our story, something inevitable and right. The engagement itself was simple, just the two of us sitting on a blanket during a quiet picnic in the park. There was no grand gesture, but it didn't matter, it was perfect in its simplicity. We spoke of a future filled with shared dreams and promised to always prioritize each other. But looking back now, I realize how little we understood what those promises truly meant, or how they'd one day be tested. Our marriage started off like a dream. We bought a cozy little house and built a life brimming with joy, laughter, and respect. Evenings were often spent in the kitchen, preparing meals together, while our weekends were reserved for hiking trips or visits with friends. It was nothing fancy, but it was ours, and that simplicity made it feel complete. I felt secure in what we had, certain that nothing could shake the foundation we had built. But after a few years, small cracks began to form. Susan's playful nature, which I had always adored, occasionally crossed the line into something that felt different. In social settings, her charm could come across as flirtation, something I hadn't noticed at first. I told myself it was harmless, that it was just who she was, and I trusted her implicitly. I didn't want to question her, or worse, question us. Yet now, with hindsight, I can't help but wonder, were those moments early signs of what was to come? Warnings I should have paid more attention to. At the time, I brushed off the uneasy feelings. I wanted to believe we were still the same couple, the one with shared dreams and unwavering trust. But as life often does, it had other plans, plans that I never saw coming. I chose to ignore the unease growing in the back of my mind, convincing myself it was nothing more than the strain of Susan's new job. Things shifted when she joined Brockton Publishing. She threw herself into the role with passion, and her colleagues often spoke highly of her creativity and charm. I was genuinely proud of her success, but at the same time, I couldn't help but notice the subtle changes creeping into our relationship, the longer hours, the new acquaintances she never seemed eager to introduce, and the quiet distance growing between us. Something felt off, but I clung to the idea that it was just the pressure of a demanding career. That evening, when I spotted Greg at the bar, he looked different. There was tension in his posture, and his usual easygoing smile seemed forced. He greeted me with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes, and although something about his energy felt off, I decided to play along. He suggested we grab a pitcher of beer, and I followed him to a secluded booth near the back of the room. We began with harmless small talk, sports, mostly. We shared a few laughs about the Reds and agreed that third place was probably the best they could hope for this season. The conversation then drifted toward the latest scandal making waves in town, a bizarre situation involving the mayor's chief of staff and a church treasurer caught up in a call-girl operation. Greg chuckled at the absurdity of it all, making a quick joke about their creativity, and I laughed along. But even as we exchanged light-hearted banter, I couldn't ignore the tension in the air. There was something else on Greg's mind, something more serious. The conversation shifted again, this time to office gossip from Brockton Publishing, where Greg worked alongside Susan. He mentioned minor promotions and petty rivalries, nothing out of the ordinary, but as he spoke, I noticed how restless he had become. His hands fidgeted constantly, his eyes flicked around the room as if searching for an exit, and his responses became increasingly distracted. I didn't press him, but it was clear something was weighing on him heavily. Finally, Greg took a deep breath, and the casual tone vanished. "You know," he started, his voice lower now, "I didn't want to be the one to say anything, but I thought you should know." I felt a knot form in my stomach, tightening with every second of silence that followed. I didn't interrupt, waiting for him to finish. "She's been seeing someone," he said quietly, glancing away as if ashamed. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. It started small, just friendly lunches and late-night work sessions. But then, it turned into more. I clenched my jaw, the words sinking in like stones. "How long?" I asked sharply, trying to keep my voice steady despite the anger bubbling inside me. Greg hesitated before answering. "A few months," he admitted. "They've met up outside the office, once in Louisville, and again on Tuesday when both of you were off work." A mix of rage and disbelief surged through me. "And she convinced you I was okay with this? That it was some kind of game?" My voice was strained, each word laced with tension. Greg nodded reluctantly, looking utterly ashamed. "She was convincing. Said you'd been doing this for years, that it was something you both agreed on." He trailed off, clearly uncomfortable. "Andy, I swear, I didn't know how to tell you. I'm sorry." The air between us grew heavy as I absorbed his confession. My mind reeled, struggling to process the enormity of what I had just learned. After a moment of tense silence, I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to stay composed despite the turmoil brewing inside me. "Greg, I had no idea," I said quietly, trying to steady my voice. "I thought I was married to someone I could trust." He looked genuinely devastated, his guilt apparent in every line of his face. As much as I wanted to lash out, I knew Greg wasn't entirely to blame. Over the years, I'd noticed Susan's playful nature around others, but I had never questioned her loyalty. Sure, she was charming and outgoing, but I trusted her implicitly. I never imagined she'd cross that line. Our intimacy had been ordinary, but fulfilling, or so I thought. I believed it was enough for both of us, but clearly, I was wrong. By the time I finished my drink, I still wasn't ready to confront her. The whole situation felt surreal, like some twisted nightmare I couldn't wake from. I needed more information from Greg to piece everything together, even though hearing it was tearing me apart. At home, I tried to act normal, but inside, I was falling apart. Greg's words echoed in my head, feeding my growing anger. The woman he described didn't sound like the wife I thought I knew. I gestured for him to continue, and though he squirmed in discomfort, he obliged. "I won't go into detail, Andy," he said hesitantly, "but she was intense. It was obvious she enjoyed it, and she talked a lot. Said it thrilled her to share everything with you afterward." He stopped, watching me carefully, waiting for a reaction. I stayed silent, my expression unreadable, even as my heart pounded with rage and disbelief. "How long?" I finally asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. "A few months," Greg admitted, shifting uneasily in his seat. I sat there, lost in thought, trying to decide what to do next. One thing was certain, my marriage couldn't continue as it had. But before making any final decisions, I needed to confirm Greg's story. Later that evening, I called my closest friend, Brian, and asked if he could meet me for dinner. I left Susan a brief message saying I'd be home late, keeping my tone light to avoid raising suspicion. When I met Brian, I laid everything out for him, recounting every painful detail. He listened carefully, asking a few questions to clarify, but mostly, he just let me talk. When I finally broke down, overwhelmed by the weight of it all, he slid a napkin across the table, offering silent support. "Are you sure about this? Brian asked after a long pause. I don't know what to believe anymore, I admitted, wiping my eyes. But I need to find out the truth, no matter how much it hurts. Brian nodded solemnly. Okay. Just, keep your head clear. Don't let your emotions push you into something you'll regret. I'll try, I said, though I wasn't sure I could pull it off. That night, I forced myself to act normal. When I got home, Susan greeted me warmly, her usual cheerful self, as if nothing was wrong. We chatted casually for a bit, talking about mundane things like work and plans for the weekend. I could feel my stomach knotting with tension, but I kept my expression neutral. Later in bed, she nestled close to me, her presence familiar yet strangely foreign. Thankfully, she didn't try to initiate anything, and once she fell asleep, I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling. My mind was racing, replaying Greg's words over and over again. Everything I thought I knew about my marriage suddenly felt like a lie. And as I lay there beside her, I knew that sooner or later, would have to confront the truth head-on. I shifted carefully in bed, making sure not to touch Susan. The physical distance, though small, brought a faint sense of relief. Lying there beside her felt strange, like sharing a bed with a stranger. Sleep remained elusive, my mind tangled in a web of emotions I couldn't untangle. 2 days later, I found myself sitting in Arnold Morrison's spacious office with Brian. Just after 10 a.m. Morrison was a calm, composed man, but there was a weariness in his eyes as he greeted us. Brian had arranged the meeting after learning Morrison had some history with Susan. I wanted answers, details that might finally give me clarity. As Morrison settled into his chair, he didn't mince words. She told me it started at the end of summer, he began, glancing at me cautiously. She said you preferred when she switched partners, that it kept things exciting for you. I clenched my jaw, fighting to keep my composure. Where did you meet? I asked, my voice low and steady. Different places, he admitted with a sigh. Sometimes in empty apartments I had access to through work. Once or twice, she even suggested your house when you were out of town. I swallowed hard, willing myself to remain calm, though every muscle in my body tensed with anger. Did she ever mention anyone else? Or how long she's been doing this? She called me her fourth or fifth buddy, Morrison said quietly, his tone laced with discomfort. But she said I was the best, that I had a certain appeal. Hearing those words felt like a punch to the gut. I forced myself to nod, signaling that I'd heard enough. Brian thanked Morrison for his time, and we left without further discussion. As we walked out of the building, I felt drained, as if the weight of this revelation had pressed all the air out of my lungs. That evening, I returned home, determined to keep up the charade a little longer. Susan greeted me in the kitchen with her usual cheerfulness, setting dinner on the table and leaning in for a kiss. I returned her smile, forcing myself to act normal. Grabbing a bottle of wine, I sat down, listening as she chattered on about her day. I offered the occasional nod in response, but my silence must have caught her attention because eventually, she tilted her head and asked, "You're awfully quiet tonight. Bad day?" "Yeah," I replied flatly, keeping my tone neutral. "I've just realized you can't always trust the people you think you can." Her smile faltered for a moment, a brief flicker of uncertainty crossing her face before she recovered. "I'm sorry to hear that," she said softly, but I didn't offer any further explanation. Instead, I continued eating in silence, thinking through my next steps. Later that night, in the bedroom, she leaned over, clearly hoping for some form of intimacy. I turned away, my voice steady but firm. "Not tonight," I said, reaching over to switch off the bedside lamp. She didn't push further, perhaps sensing something was off, though she avoided asking any questions that might force an uncomfortable truth into the open. Instead, she lay beside me, restless, her unease palpable. I stared into the darkness, haunted by memories of the life we'd built together and the betrayal that now threatened to destroy it. Hours passed, but sleep never came. The next morning, I left the house early without a word. By 7:30 a.m., I was already at my desk, determined to focus on something, anything, other than the storm raging inside me. Later that afternoon, an unexpected opportunity presented itself. A job opening had come up in Chicago, a fundraising director role with a 20% salary increase, a stronger team, and an immediate start date since the position had been vacant for months. Without hesitation, I expressed my interest and offered to interview as soon as possible. As I was getting ready to leave for the day, my phone buzzed. "Mr. Cullen, this is Ted Russa from Global Resources in Chicago," said a calm voice on the other end. "I understand you're interested in the fundraising director position." For the next 30 minutes, we discussed the role, its responsibilities, and the organization's mission. By the end of the call, I felt certain this could be my way out, a clean break from the mess my life had become. I needed distance from Susan, from everything. If the interview went well, I could start fresh, far from the memories that now haunted me. Brian called me that evening. I gave him a quick update, mentioning the potential job offer. "You need to get off Susan's radar," he advised. "When she inevitably calls, I'll tell her I don't know anything. Just get everything sorted, and when you're ready, leave without giving her a chance to pull you back in." It was sound advice, and I knew he was right. Now, I just needed to figure out how to end this without breaking apart completely. "I told them," Emily said with a confident nod. "You can count on us. And when she does reach out, I'll happily tell her exactly what I think of her." Brian grinned at her, a playful glint in his eyes. "I take it you'll stay faithful to me, then?" Emily rolled her eyes, smacking his arm with mock annoyance. "Obviously. And you'd better not even think about pulling something like this unless you're ready to lose all your dignity." We all laughed, and for the first time in days, I felt something close to relief. It was fleeting, but in that moment, surrounded by friends who had my back, the weight on my shoulders lightened, if only slightly. That night, back home, Susan tried again. As I got into bed, she leaned toward me, her tone soft, almost pleading. "I miss you," she murmured, brushing her hand gently over my arm. "I hope we can be close again soon." I turned away, my voice distant but steady. "Not tonight, Susan. I've still got a lot on my mind." She paused, clearly unsettled by my tone, but after a moment, she relented. "All right, honey. I understand," she said quietly. She withdrew to her side of the bed, but I could tell she was uneasy. It took her a long time to fall asleep, her breathing remained uneven, restless. For me, sleep was out of reach entirely. I stared into the darkness, my mind racing as I continued to plan my next move. In the days that followed, life seemed to accelerate. I focused on getting everything ready for my transition to Chicago. I found an apartment that felt perfect, modern, minimalist, and a clean slate in every sense. It was the symbol of the fresh start I desperately needed. I didn't hesitate. I signed the lease on the spot and wasted no time furnishing the place. I spent hours selecting furniture and decor, making sure every detail was handled exactly the way I wanted it. The building manager agreed to oversee the deliveries, ensuring the apartment would be fully set up before my official move-in date. To cover the smaller essentials, bedding, towels, and kitchenware, I enlisted the help of Eileen, my soon-to-be assistant. Eileen eagerly agreed, especially when I explained I'd need everything ready as soon as possible. A few days later, Emily called me with an update. "You'll love this," she said with a laugh. "Guess who's fishing for answers?" I already had a good idea. "Your darling wife," Emily replied before I could guess. She called, wanting to know if I had any clue why you're being so distant. "What did you tell her?" I asked, leaning back in my chair, half curious and half dreading the answer. "Oh, I made her squirm a little," Emily said, clearly enjoying herself. "She told me how cold you've been, how you've been avoiding her and shutting her out. So I asked her if there was anything she might have done to upset you. And I prompted, already sensing where this was going. She swore there wasn't, Emily continued with a smirk. So then I said, well, why don't you ask him directly? That shut her up pretty fast. I exhaled slowly, a mix of gratitude and exhaustion washing over me. Thanks, Emily. I appreciate it. Anytime, she said warmly. Just take care of yourself, okay? And don't let her mess with your head. You've got a new start waiting for you. Hanging up, I sat back, staring out the window. The path ahead was clearer than it had been in weeks. I had a plan, and soon, I'd be far from the life that had betrayed me. The apartment, the job, the new city, everything was falling into place. All I had to do now was make it through these last few days. I woke to the feeling of Susan pressed against me, her lips grazing my neck as her hand slid over my chest. Good morning, baby, she whispered, her voice low and suggestive. I think we should make up for lost time. I opened my eyes to meet her playful smile, but instead of sparking any warmth, it only deepened the disgust I was already struggling to contain. Gently but firmly, I placed my hands on her shoulders and pushed her back. Susan, don't, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. I don't force myself on you when you're not interested, and I expect the same courtesy. Her expression faltered, shifting from seductive to unsettled. Without a word, she turned away, clearly thrown off by my reaction. I didn't care. All I could think about was getting through the next 24 hours without losing my composure. Later that morning, I got a call from Greg, who had agreed to keep playing along. She wants to pick up where we left off, Greg said, sounding uneasy, but she said she'll wait until things with you settle down. That's fine, I replied calmly. Keep pretending everything's normal. It'll all come to light soon enough. Just remember, don't let her know we've spoken. Don't worry, Greg assured me. She won't suspect a thing. I hung up, feeling a grim sense of satisfaction. Everything was in place, and Monday was coming fast. The day I had planned for, the day everything would change, was almost here. Monday morning arrived, bringing with it a strange mix of anxiety and relief. As I finished breakfast, I noticed Susan heading into the bedroom to get ready for work. She paused mid-step when she saw me, still in sweatpants and clearly not preparing to leave for the office. Aren't you going in today? She asked, her tone tentative. No, I replied simply, offering no further explanation. She lingered for a moment, as though she wanted to ask more, but eventually shrugged and went on with her routine. I stayed quiet, watching her from the corner of my eye, knowing this was the last time I'd see her in this house. As soon as she left for work, I sprang into action. I gathered the last of my things, loaded up the car, and drove straight to the airport. By the time Susan returned home, she'd find nothing but a short, blunt note on the kitchen table, placed under my wedding ring and phone. It was the only farewell she'd get. The note was simple. Susan. It's over. Don't contact me. Andy. By 7:30 p.m., I was unpacking in my new Chicago apartment, arranging my belongings and trying to make the place feel like home. Later that evening, I walked to a nearby pizza joint, ordered a pie and a beer, and raised a quiet toast to myself. Here's to the first day of the rest of my life, a life without Susan. It felt surreal, but for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to feel hopeful. The day before, I had spoken to Brian and Emily, giving them my new contact information and address, with strict instructions to keep everything under wraps. They had been incredibly supportive throughout the ordeal, checking in regularly to make sure I was holding up. Their call that Sunday brought a welcome distraction. Emily, ever eager to share gossip, had filled me in on her recent encounter with Susan. She called Monday night, Emily said, clearly relishing the memory. She was hysterical, sobbing so hard I could barely understand her. But eventually, she managed to choke out something about you disappearing and leaving a note. And what did you say? I asked, curious about how Emily had handled the situation. I told her I had no idea where you were, Emily replied, grinning through the phone. But I made sure to sound surprised, like it was news to me. She kept asking if I'd noticed anything strange about you lately, if you'd mentioned anything about leaving. And I let her squirm a bit before saying, well, maybe you should have thought about what you were doing before things got this bad. That shut her up pretty quickly. I couldn't help but laugh, despite the heaviness still sitting in my chest. Thanks, Emily. You've been a huge help. Anytime, she said, her tone softening. We're proud of you, Andy. You deserve a fresh start. Hanging up, I sat back, taking a deep breath. It wasn't over, there were still emotions to process, wounds to heal, but at least I was on my way. A new city, a new job, and a life without Susan. It wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long while, I felt ready to move forward. I pieced together the gist of what Emily was telling me, and as much as I tried to stay composed, the fact that I still missed Susan infuriated me further. After everything I had done for her, after all the love and trust one had given, how dare she betray me and leave me to pick up the pieces of my shattered life? The anger simmered beneath the surface, refusing to fade, no matter how hard I tried to push it away. Over the next 2 weeks, Brian and Emily became my lifeline. I called them often, venting about my new job, the loneliness that came with starting over in a new city, and the lingering fury that refused to let go. They listened patiently, offering unwavering support. Every conversation ended with them reminding me that things would get better, that time would eventually dull the sharp edges of the pain. Meanwhile, Susan was on a relentless search for answers, reaching out to anyone she thought might know where I was. Emily kept me updated, relaying each new attempt Susan made to track me down. But the real blow came when Emily decided it was time to reveal something she had kept to herself, a grim truth about Susan's past. She betrayed you long before this, Emily said, her tone a mixture of outrage and bitter satisfaction, as if she had been waiting for the right moment to tell me. It started years ago, with some charming British guy she met at a literary event. I clenched my jaw, my pulse quickening. Go on, I said quietly, bracing myself for what was coming. Emily sighed. Apparently, he charmed her with his accent and sharp wit. They spent the evening talking, and by the end of it, he invited her out for drinks. She told me she initially turned him down, saying she was married and couldn't possibly, but that didn't last long. I could almost hear Emily rolling her eyes as she continued. She claimed it was exciting because it was new. She actually convinced herself that doing something like that would somehow improve things with you. Like, spicing up her life would make your marriage better. She thought she'd found some kind of twisted win-win. I exhaled sharply, trying to steady the storm of rage building inside me. Unbelievable, I muttered through gritted teeth. The sheer audacity of Susan's logic made my head spin. How could she possibly justify something so selfish? It gets worse, Emily added, her voice dropping. What started as one mistake snowballed. At first, it was just a few random one-night stands, maybe once or twice a year. But over time, it became more frequent. She said it made her feel alive. I sat in stunned silence, the weight of her words sinking in. None of this was truly shocking anymore. I had already known Susan had betrayed me. But hearing the details spelled out so plainly left me feeling hollow. How had I been so blind? How had I trusted someone who had so thoroughly dismantled the life we had built together? She was bored, Emily concluded, shaking her head in disbelief. That's all it came down to. She got bored with her life, with everything you gave her, and instead of talking to you or trying to work on things, she went looking for excitement elsewhere. The words hung in the air like a dark cloud, thick with bitterness. I tried to quiet the dark thoughts swirling in my mind, but they wouldn't stop. I felt like I was drowning in the enormity of it all. The betrayal wasn't just an isolated incident, it was a pattern, a recurring choice she had made over the years. I don't even know what to say anymore, I said quietly, running a hand over my face. It's like, every time I think I've heard the worst of it, something else comes out. How could I have been so stupid? How could I not have seen what was happening right in front of me? You weren't stupid, Andy, Emily said firmly. You trusted her. You believed in your marriage, in her. That's not something to blame yourself for. I wanted to believe her, but it was hard to shake the feeling of shame and regret. I had given my heart to someone who didn't deserve it, and now I was left to pick up the pieces of a life I no longer recognized. As I sat there, I realized that while the anger and pain were still raw, something else was starting to take shape, a resolve to move forward. Susan's betrayal may have broken me, but it wouldn't define me. I had a new life waiting, and I wasn't going to let the past keep me from living it. It was time to close the door on this chapter, no matter how painful it was. Thanks, Emily, I said finally. For everything. I don't know what I'd do without you and Brian right now. You'll get through this, she said with a reassuring smile in her voice. One day at a time. Everyone gets bored sometimes in marriage, I said finally, my voice laced with bitterness. But you don't cheat. You talk to your partner. You find ways to reignite the spark, take a trip, try something new, anything but this. The words hung in the air, heavy with frustration and disbelief. Susan's latest voicemail was playing in the background, her tearful voice filling the room. Please call me back, you're the only man I've ever loved. The message dragged on for 5 excruciating minutes, filled with desperate pleas and hollow promises. Not a single word surprised me. Not a single word diminished my anger. Did she truly believe that an apology could erase years of deceit and betrayal? That somehow, because she finally felt guilty, I'd be able to forgive her? As the message ended, I deleted it without hesitation. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to save. I poured myself a drink, the weight of everything pressing down on me once more. There was no fixing this, not for her, and certainly not for me. The next day, I spoke to Eileen. Susan's calls continued like clockwork, every couple of days, each one filled with more desperation than the last. The messages had grown shorter, but the content was always the same: apologies, declarations of love, and pleas for another chance. They grated on my nerves, each one a painful reminder of the trust she had destroyed. And yet, not once did her words make me reconsider. Every message only reinforced my decision to leave her behind. By Monday evening, as I was wrapping up for the day, Eileen appeared in my doorway with a sly smile playing on her lips. It's handled, she announced confidently. I found someone perfect. Perfect for what? I asked, already sensing that she was up to something. Perfect for helping you move on, she replied cryptically. I didn't press her for details, I trusted Eileen to handle it. All I knew was that whatever she had in mind, it was something that would help put even more distance between me and the mess I'd left behind. On Wednesday, as I passed by Eileen's desk, I stopped briefly. Saturday at 1 o'clock, I said quietly. Can your mystery person be there by noon? Absolutely, she answered with a confident nod. Then, with a mischievous glint in her eye, she added, but you owe me a call afterward. I couldn't help but crack a small smile, despite the storm still raging inside me. Deal, I said, walking away. Whatever came next, I was ready. Ready to let go of the past, ready to rebuild my life, and ready to finally stop looking back at what could never be repaired. Saturday would mark the start of something new, a chance to close the door on the pain and move forward for good. I want every juicy detail, Eileen had said with a mischievous grin. Consider it my reward. Later that day, as I waited for the plan to unfold, I found myself still thinking about her words. I wasn't sure what to expect, but when the doorbell rang and I opened it, I was stunned into momentary silence. Christina stood there, carrying herself with effortless grace. I hadn't expected her. Hello, Andy, she said warmly, her tone tinged with amusement. Surprise. I blinked, struggling to find my words. Christina was, without a doubt, one of the most beautiful women I had ever met. I'd admired her from afar on more than one occasion, but I had never imagined she'd be part of this. Christina. Eileen told you about today? I finally managed, still trying to process her unexpected appearance. She smiled, stepping inside and holding up a small shopping bag. She did. Don't worry, I know exactly what I'm doing. Her confidence was reassuring, though I was still wrapping my head around the situation. As she settled in, some of the weight that had been pressing on me for weeks seemed to lift, if only for a moment. For the first time in what felt like forever, I caught myself wondering, if things had been different, would I have ever had the courage to ask Christina out? But now wasn't the time for such thoughts. This wasn't about that. As the clock crept toward 12:45, I glanced at my watch and took a deep breath. Christina, it's almost time. If you're sure you're ready, you should probably head to the bedroom. She rose gracefully from her chair, her expression unwavering. I've got this, she said with quiet confidence. Without hesitation, she turned and made her way to the room. I stayed behind, mentally preparing myself for what was to come. A few minutes later, there was a knock at the door. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to remain calm, and opened it. Susan stood there, looking anxious yet hopeful. She had dressed carefully, probably thinking it would help her cause. Andy, she began softly, but I cut her off with a neutral tone. Hi, Susan. Come in. She hesitated for a moment, perhaps sensing that something was off, but eventually stepped inside. I gestured toward the living room. Can I get you something to drink? Without waiting for her reply, I headed to the kitchen and poured 2 sodas, my hands steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside me. By the time I returned to the table, I had forced my expression into one of calm detachment. We sat across from each other, the silence between us thick and heavy. Susan leaned forward, reaching for my hands, but I kept mine firmly on my lap, unwilling to offer her the connection she sought. All right, Susan, I said evenly, my tone devoid of emotion. Let's hear it. What do you have to say for yourself? I leaned forward, pressing Susan for answers, my voice cold and unyielding. How many, Susan? How many people were there? Her eyes darted away, tears welling up as if she was trying to shield herself from the weight of the question. I don't know, she stammered. I pressed harder, refusing to let her evade the truth. Give me a number, 10, 20, 50. Her voice cracked as she finally spoke. Maybe 20, she whispered, barely audible. I sat back, letting the weight of her confession settle over us like a suffocating blanket. The number hung in the air, heavy with betrayal. And how many times did you sleep with them? I asked, my tone relentless, refusing to let her off the hook. Tears streamed down her face as she murmured, I don't know. Think, I snapped, my patience gone. Do the math. Take your time. She hesitated, visibly trembling as she tried to come up with an answer. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she whispered, maybe 200 times. The words hit me like a punch to the gut, each syllable driving home the depth of her betrayal. I sat there in stunned silence, fighting the urge to react. Instead, I kept my voice cold and steady. 200 times, I repeated, the disbelief and bitterness cutting through each word. And how many of those times? Before I could finish my sentence, Christina's voice purred from the doorway, cutting through the tension like a knife. Andy, you said you'd be done by now. When are you coming back to bed? Susan whipped around, her expression frozen in shock as she took in the sight of Christina leaning casually against the doorframe. Her hair was tousled, lips slightly smudged, and she wore a sheer pale blue robe that left little to the imagination. Christina exuded confidence, elegance, and a quiet air of victory. For the first time all day, I allowed myself a genuine smile. Christina, standing there effortlessly, was the perfect finishing touch to everything I had planned. Susan's face contorted with disbelief and confusion, her eyes darting between me and Christina as if trying to make sense of what she was seeing. I remained silent, letting the scene speak for itself. After Susan left, still reeling from what she had witnessed, I felt the adrenaline coursing through me. Christina was still standing in the doorway of my bedroom, a quiet confidence radiating from her. "Christina," I said softly, my voice catching slightly, "you're absolutely stunning." She smiled, her eyes glistening with restrained emotion. "Thank you, Andy. I guess this," she gestured to her elegant robe with a slight smirk, "did its job." "You didn't just shake her up," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "You completely unraveled her." Her smile was bittersweet. "It was cathartic for me too, in some way," she admitted quietly. "It felt like closure for what my ex, Harris, did to me. That betrayal still stings." I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Betrayal leaves scars, ones that don't heal easily, if ever. But in that moment, standing there with Christina, I felt a small sense of relief. Maybe this wasn't the end, it was the beginning of something new. And for the first time in a long while, I felt ready to move forward. "I'm sorry you went through all that," I said quietly, my voice filled with genuine emotion. "No one should have to endure what you did." Christina smiled warmly, her eyes soft with understanding. "It wasn't just for you, Andy. It was for me too. And you've given me more than you realize." She leaned in, placing one last gentle kiss on my lips before pulling back. "Now, get some rest. You've earned it." As she left, I stayed where I was, feeling the warmth of her words lingering long after she had gone. I lay awake, replaying the events of the day, the confrontation with Susan, the unexpected closeness with Christina, and the way everything had unraveled. It was exhausting, and eventually, sleep claimed me. When I woke, the apartment was silent. I wandered aimlessly from room to room, trying to process everything that had happened. The weight of the past few weeks still hung over me, but there was something new, a sense of possibility, like maybe the worst was finally behind me. Later in the day, I picked up the phone and called Christina. My heart raced as I waited for her to answer, unsure of what exactly I wanted to say. When she picked up, I found myself smiling despite the tension in my chest. "I just wanted to thank you again, for everything," I said, my voice steady but sincere. That evening, as I stood outside in the cool Chicago air, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, joy. It wasn't forced or fleeting, it was real. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe that life was offering me a second chance. Years later, on a calm Chicago morning, I sat by the window with a mug of coffee, gazing down at the bustling city below. The echoes of the past, once so sharp and consuming, had softened over time. What had once felt like unbearable pain now seemed like a necessary chapter in my life, a painful but crucial step toward the future I was meant to have. From the other room, I heard Christina's laughter, light and joyful, carrying through the apartment. I smiled to myself, setting down my coffee and savoring the moment. "I love you," I said softly, even though she wasn't in the room to hear it. For the first time, I wasn't just moving on, I was truly living.